Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, Content Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, which is part of the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Welcome to our Middle School Civics Highlights series. Today we focus on benchmark CG 4.3. Describe examples of the United States actions and reactions in international conflicts. In Part 3, we focus on identifying different methods used by the United States to deal with international conflicts. We are going to identify the different methods used by the United States to deal with international conflicts. What are these methods, and how are they similar and different from one another? First, we'll be looking at espionage. The word espionage includes as its root spy. Even though the spy is spelled a little bit different, we often think of spying on someone, which is espionage, as to collect and report information focusing on enemy groups or a country's operations. So here we have one way for the United States to collect information to see if there might be another government or group of people, such as a terrorist group, working against the United States or making plans to work against the United States. Humanitarian efforts are quite different. With humanitarian efforts, help and support is given to save lives and respond to human suffering following a catastrophic event, which might be a war, hurricane, flood, or other tragic weather event, or terrorism. Peacekeeping operations focus on activities intended to create peaceful conditions to avoid conflict and war. So this means that the United States might have individuals come representing the United States to observe and to perhaps consult and give advice on how to maintain and create peaceful conditions. Or sanctions. Sanctions are a way to use financial and economic methods to punish or prevent bad behavior by a government. So, for example, if a government has behaved badly, then the United States might take action by denying that country the right to do business in the United States, or by freezing that government's assets if those assets or monies are kept in banks in the United States. The United States might deny access to that country's money if that country's money is being held by United States banks or in other kinds of economic arenas, economic areas such as the stock market or investment in companies or something like that. The United States has also declared war. A declaration of war is a formal action to take military action against one or more nations. A war ends with either a treaty or surrender. And this is an important distinction, which means that to walk away from a war if the United States isn't doing well or wants to get out of a really bad situation, if a war has already been declared, then the U.S. must either negotiate a treaty, as Woodrow Wilson tried to do at the end of World War I and the Senate refused to ratify, or it could be just withdrawing troops, as President Ford did to end the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. So President Ford arranged for troops and Americans who were in Vietnam to leave Vietnam, even though there was no treaty, but there was also no declaration of war. Focusing on diplomacy, these are efforts to keep good relations between the governments of different countries. In the United States, it is the Department of State, and specifically the Secretary of State, who is responsible for representing the United States in its international relations. And so the face of U.S. foreign policy is the Secretary of State. With military invasions, members of the United States military are sent to one or more other countries to use force to stop a conflict. And then the United States has also developed alliances with other nations. Alliances are formal relationships between and among nations for assistance and cooperation. So this might be an international organization or forming a formal relationship through a treaty or an executive agreement. Here we have the formation of these alliances and these partnerships. We continue our discussion of different methods used by the United States to deal with international conflict. One way that the U.S. deals with international conflict is by joining international organizations. And by joining international organizations, the United States is saying that they support the mission of the organization, that the United States shares common goals and purposes of the organization, that the United States is well represented in the organization, and consequently, some of these relationships involve that the United States has agreed that by being a member of that organization, such as with NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that the United States will come to the aid of member nations that are attacked by non-member nations. The United States might also increase taxes on goods coming in from other countries, and by adding to the cost of importing goods and services, those goods and services might be more expensive, thus making U.S.-based goods and services that are similar or the same to those goods and services being imported more competitive, because they're then going to be less expensive compared with the imported goods and services because of the increased taxes placed on those imported goods and services. The U.S. can also limit trade with certain nations. By limiting the purchase and sale of goods and services between and among nations, the United States can also play a role in trying to address an ongoing or a recent international conflict. The United States can also decide to isolate itself and decide against being involved with other nations' conflicts. So this issue arose at the end of World War I. At the end of World War I, President Woodrow Wilson negotiated the Treaty of Versailles, and the Treaty of Versailles would create the League of Nations, and this was a league of friendship where the members of the League of Nations, if one of those nations was attacked by a non-member nation, that other members of the League of Nations would agree to defend and support the nation, the member nation that was attacked. And the U.S. Senate at the time was more supportive of isolating itself, of what many call isolationism. And consequently, even though President Wilson negotiated the Treaty of Versailles, a majority of U.S. senators refused to ratify that treaty. Thus, the United States did not become involved in the League of Nations, even though Woodrow Wilson played such a big role in creating the League of Nations. And of course, the United States plays a role in making treaties. A treaty is a formal agreement between two or more nations, but treaties do require that the U.S. Senate will ratify. And there are going to be times that if the president is concerned about not getting Senate ratification, the Senate might enter an executive agreement. And an executive agreement is a relationship that the president establishes with another country. It is an executive action. It cannot be checked by Congress, but at the same time, it also is very limited in its authority. Thank you for joining me for Middle School Civics Highlights. Do you still have questions? Please contact us using the information that appears on the screen. Till next time, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Thank you for joining me.